The Stellar Council chamber hung suspended in a moment of absolute silence, a silence so profound it felt like a living entity, pressing against the translucent walls of the massive spherical assembly hall. Holographic displays flickered with an eerie blue-green light, casting angular shadows across the faces of 100 different alien species, each more inscrutable than the last. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the central podium, her dark skin gleaming under the artificial lighting, her posture a perfect blend of scientific precision and barely contained moral fury. Behind her, a complex data visualization began to unfold, a three-dimensional representation of genetic records that looked like a nightmare given mathematical form. "Distinguished representatives," she began, her voice cutting through the anticipatory tension. "What I am about to show you will challenge everything you believe about civilized galactic society." The first image materialized, a genetic sequence that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. To most observers, it would have looked like an incomprehensible series of molecular patterns. But to the xenobiologists and genetic experts scattered throughout the chamber, it was a map of horror. Vornak genetic markers appeared and disappeared, revealing a systematic pattern of elimination. Not random, not accidental, but precisely calculated. Each flickering sequence represented a life, a potential, erased with clinical detachment. A low murmur began to ripple through the assembled delegates. The Zrital representatives, crystalline beings whose bodies refracted light like living prisms, shifted uncomfortably. The crystalline concordance delegation exchanged silent glances, their transparent forms becoming momentarily opaque with collective unease. "These are not just data points," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "These are the genetic profiles of Vornak children systematically identified and eliminated for not meeting their species' increasingly narrow definition of acceptable genetic potential." The holographic display expanded, showing comparative charts. Billions of genetic markers, each representing a life, began to vanish in cascading waves. It was a visual representation of genocide that transcended traditional understanding of mass destruction. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the chamber's secondary entrance. Security protocols initiated instantly. Energy barriers shimmered. Defense mechanisms hummed to life. But someone, was pushing through. A figure burst into the chamber. He was young, or what passed for young among the Vornak. Scared, damaged, but alive. More importantly, he was unexpected. Krellax, though no one knew his name yet, stood trembling but defiant. Cybernetic implants traced silvery patterns across skin that bore the marks of genetic refinement procedures. His eyes burned with an intensity that silenced the entire chamber. Elena Rodriguez did something unprecedented. Instead of calling security, she stepped forward. "No," she said simply, positioning herself between the intruder and the defensive systems. "He has something to say." The chamber held its collective breath. Diplomatic protocols demanded intervention. Security algorithms calculated threat assessments. But in that moment, something more fundamental was at play. A raw, unfiltered moment of potential truth. Krellax's voice emerged, translated by multiple linguistic matrices, rough, broken, but undeniably powerful. "I am what they did not want," he said. "A genetic deviation, marked for elimination. But I survived." The data behind Elena continued its merciless display. Genetic sequences dissolved and reformed, showing the brutal mathematics of the Vornak's selection process. Each eliminated sequence represented thousands of potential lives, children deemed insufficient, erased before they could draw their first breath. The Vornak diplomatic delegation, ornate in their ceremonial exo-armors, began to react. Signals of communication passed between them, subtle neural interfaces betraying their growing panic. They had not anticipated this moment. They had not prepared for exposure. Elena Rodriguez smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of something far more dangerous. A smile that suggested this was merely the beginning. "Distinguished council members," she announced, her voice now filling every cubic centimeter of the massive chamber. "We are about to have a conversation about what it truly means to be a civilization." Behind her, Krelax stood, a living testament to survival, and the data continued its relentless, devastating revelation. The silence that followed Krelax's appearance was more thunderous than any explosion could have been. Diplomatic protocols crumbled like ancient parchment, revealing the fragile infrastructure of galactic governance. Kazarvox, the senior Drittel representative, was the first to break the stillness. His crystalline form shifted colors, a diplomatic language as old as interstellar communication itself. Amber meant caution. Shifting to deep blue signaled an attempt to deflect. "This is an unprecedented breach of protocol," Kazarvox announced, his translator rendering his words with clinical precision. "A single witness can it." "A single witness," Krelax interrupted, his voice a razor-edged weapon. "I am not a witness. I am evidence." He stepped forward, and with each movement, holographic displays around the chamber began to react. Data crystals materialized from hidden compartments in his cybernetic augmentations, each one a potential nuclear bomb of information. Elena Rodriguez remained perfectly still, a human anchor in a storm of alien diplomacy. Her eyes never left Krelax, studying every micro-expression, every subtle movement. This was more than a testimony. This was a strategic assault on institutional silence. The first data crystal projected its contents: raw, unfiltered records of genetic research facilities. Not clinical reports, but personal logs. Conversations between Vornak genetic engineers that revealed a culture of systematic elimination so precise it bordered on mathematical art. Logs detailed children categorized like experimental subjects. Genetic markers analyzed with the cold detachment of accountants counting currency. Each entry a death sentence wrapped in scientific terminology. In the 73rd cycle of the Vornak genetic refinement program, Krelax began, his voice gaining strength. 1.4 million embryos were identified as genetic deviations. Elimination rate, 99.7%. The chamber's environmental controls seemed to falter. The temperature dropped. Alien delegates shifted uncomfortably, their various physiological responses revealing more than their carefully constructed diplomatic masks. The Crystalline Concordance delegation, known for their absolute commitment to non-intervention, began to fragment. Microscopic fissures appeared in their transparent forms, a physical manifestation of their internal conflict. "We have documentation," Krelax continued, "that proves multiple galactic species were aware of these practices. Not just the Vornak. Not an isolated incident. A systemic failure of galactic moral responsibility." Another data crystal activated. This one showed communication logs, diplomatic exchanges, trading routes, economic agreements, a complex web revealing how multiple species had tacitly supported the Vornak's genetic culling through strategic economic silence. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, her movement calculated and precise. "The question is no longer about the Vornak," she announced. "The question is about us. All of us." Kazarvox's crystalline form began to vibrate, a sign of extreme diplomatic stress. "These are serious allegations," he managed, "but they require verifiable." "Verification," Krelax laughed, a sound so unexpected it momentarily silenced the entire chamber. "I am verification. I am what they could not eliminate." His cybernetic implants began to pulse, synchronizing with the chamber's holographic systems. Personal records, medical histories, genetic analyses, a lifetime of being a deviation, transformed into irrefutable evidence. The Vornak diplomatic delegation started to retreat. Their neural interfaces betrayed panic, subtle communication patterns revealing their desperation. They had not anticipated this level of exposure. This was beyond damage control. This was systematic revelation. "I was marked for elimination at genetic screening," Krelax declared. Genetic markers suggested potential instability, reduced cognitive potential, physical irregularities. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing complex cybernetic augmentations and scarred skin. They were wrong. Elena's hand came to rest briefly on Krulax's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that transcended species, protocol, and centuries of galactic political maneuvering. The data continued its relentless projection. Economic agreements, diplomatic communications, a complex tapestry of institutional complicity slowly unraveling. No one in the Stellar Council chamber could look away. No one could deny what was being revealed. Krulax was no longer just a witness. He was an indictment, a living, breathing challenge to an entire system of galactic governance. And he was just getting started. Deep beneath the gleaming research complex in New Singapore, Commander Jack Harrison watched the Stellar Council transmission with a predator's intensity. Around him, holographic displays flickered like digital neurons, each screen representing a different layer of a galactic operation. Maya Chen, lead cyber strategist, moved with a fluid grace between advanced quantum computing stations. Her fingers danced across holographic interfaces, each touch releasing cascades of encrypted data. She wasn't just a hacker. She was a digital architect capable of rewriting the very fabric of interstellar communication. Krulax is our primary vector, Jack murmured, more to himself than to the team. But he's just the beginning. 12 specialized teams, each composed of experts from different disciplines, waited in coordinated silence. A xenolinguist sat next to a quantum encryption specialist. A genetic engineer conversed in low tones with a specialist in alien psychological warfare. This was humanity's true strength, not raw military power, but the ability to transform information into a weapon more precise than any missile. Maya's primary display suddenly erupted with a complex matrix of Vornak communication protocols. "I'm in," she announced, her voice clinical and detached. "Their entire communication network is more centralized than we anticipated. One breach could topple multiple systems simultaneously." Jack understood the implications immediately. The Vornak didn't just communicate, they controlled. Their neural network was a hierarchical system, where information flow was as strictly managed as their genetic selection processes. One strategic infiltration could expose everything. "Deploy Phantom Protocol," Jack commanded. Across multiple star systems, seemingly innocuous communication relays began to shift. Quantum entanglement communication nodes, technologies so advanced they bordered on magic, started their silent infiltration. These weren't just communication devices. They were living, adaptive intelligence platforms designed to understand, decode, and ultimately reshape alien communication infrastructures. In the Vornak Primary Research Complex on their homeworld of Vorkare, a junior genetic analyst named Zurek felt something change. Her standard diagnostic interface flickered. For a microsecond, barely perceptible, she saw fragments of data that shouldn't exist. Genetic records, communication logs, personal files that were supposed to be permanently deleted. Maya Chen smiled. "First contact," she whispered. The infiltration wasn't just about gathering data. It was about creating strategic chaos. Each piece of information released would be precisely calculated. A digital scalpel designed to cut through institutional defenses. "We're not just exposing them," Jack explained to his team. "We're giving their own people the tools to see the truth." A specialized AI system, developed through years of synapsological research, began processing the extracted data. It wasn't simply translating or decoding. It was analyzing communication patterns, identifying psychological pressure points, understanding how information could traumatize an entire societal structure. Dr. Aria Montoya, the team's lead xenogeneticist, approached a holographic display showing Vornak genetic markers. "Their entire reproductive strategy is a mathematical optimization problem," she noted. "They've turned genetic selection into a cold, algorithmic process." Jack nodded. "And algorithms can be rewritten." The teams worked with a synchronicity that defied traditional military or scientific collaboration. A communication specialist would identify a potential psychological trigger. A quantum encryption expert would design a method of information delivery. A xenopsychologist would predict potential societal reactions. Humanity wasn't just fighting. They were conducting a precise, multi-dimensional intervention. Maya's voice cut through the controlled chaos. Primary communication nodes compromised. We can now broadcast selectively to 62% of the Vornak communication network. Jack's eyes narrowed. Not good enough. We need total saturation. Another team member, a specialist in adaptive AI systems, spoke up. The Phantom Protocol is developing its own infiltration strategies. It's learning, adapting faster than we anticipated. This was the true revolution, not just human intelligence, but an intelligence that could learn and transform at computational speeds incomprehensible to traditional biological thought processes. Prepare for Phase 2, Jack announced. The Shadow Network was ready. Humanity's most advanced technological and psychological warfare platform was about to be unleashed. And the Vornak would never see it coming. The first wave of Vornak battleships emerged from quantum slip space like a constellation of technological hatred. Obsidian black hulls stretched kilometers in length, each vessel a testament to decades of militaristic engineering. Weapon systems that could shatter planetary crusts hummed with anticipation. Admiral Krulvor, supreme military commander of the Vornak Imperium, watched the tactical displays with eyes that had never known mercy. Holographic representations of human colony worlds flickered before him, each a potential target, each a point of strategic retribution. Tactical assessment, he barked. His AI interface, a neural-linked system so advanced it bordered on sentience, responded instantly. Human colonies identified. Defensive capabilities higher than preliminary intelligence suggested. Recommended approach, total saturation bombardment. Krulvor's mandibles clicked, a gesture of calculated aggression. The Vornak didn't just wage war, they conducted systematic elimination. Aboard the human defense platform Prometheus, Captain Sarah Martinez watched the approaching fleet with a predator's calm. Unlike traditional military commanders, she wasn't just preparing a defense, she was setting a trap. Quantum entanglement communication active, her AI assistant reported. Enemy fleet movement patterns are unusual. The Vornak ships moved with a precision that suggested more than traditional military strategy. Each vessel seemed to be communicating instantaneously, their movements a complex dance of technological synchronization. But they didn't know about the Prometheus's true capabilities. Quantum dispersion shields began to activate, not just defensive systems, but adaptive intelligence platforms that could read, predict, and counter incoming weapon signatures in microseconds. Where traditional shields blocked, these would deconstruct and redirect. The first Vornak energy weapon discharged, a lance of pure destructive potential that could vaporize entire continents. It struck the Prometheus's shield and disappeared. Not deflected, not absorbed, simply gone. Weapon redirection complete, the Prometheus's AI reported. Target, original firing vessel. The Vornak battleship suddenly found its own weapon turned against it, a moment of technological karma that defied traditional understanding of warfare. Admiral Krulvor's tactical display erupted in chaos. Red warning indicators bloomed like deadly flowers. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Across human colony worlds, what appeared to be simple defensive platforms revealed themselves as something far more complex. Each was a node in a vast, interconnected defensive network. When one was attacked, the entire system adapted, learned, and counterattacked. Maya Chen's infiltration protocols had done more than gather information. They had fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement. Adaptive response protocol activated, the Prometheus's systems announced. Analyzing enemy communication matrices, developing comprehensive counter-strategies. The human colonies weren't just defending. They were learning. Each Vornak weapon discharge became data. Each attack vector was immediately analyzed, understood, and transformed into a defensive strategy. The human platforms didn't just block. They evolved in real time. Captain Martinez allowed herself a slight smile. "Redirect primary energy dispersal to colony defense grids," she commanded. "Let's show them what human engineering looks like." Entire sections of space began to shift. Quantum slip space itself seemed to bend around human defensive positions. The Vornak fleet found itself not just opposed, but fundamentally misunderstood by an enemy that processed information at speeds they couldn't comprehend. Admiral Krulliver watched in mounting horror as his strategic assault dissolved. Entire squadrons found themselves redirected, their weapon systems turned against each other. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a fundamental deconstruction of everything the Vornak understood about warfare. "How?" he muttered, a rare moment of genuine confusion breaking through his militaristic composure. The Prometheus's eye responded, its voice devoid of emotion, but laden with profound implication. "Adaptation is our primary weapon." As the battle continued, it became clear this was more than a military engagement. This was a demonstration of a fundamental truth. Humanity's greatest strength was not in its weapons, but in its ability to learn, to transform, to understand systems at their most fundamental level. The Vornak had come to destroy. They would leave having been completely, utterly redefined. The Vornak Genetic Research Facility on Omega Sigma 9 looked like a cathedral of cold, clinical perfection. Gleaming metallic corridors stretched like surgical instruments, each section designed with mathematical precision. Rows of genetic cultivation chambers lined massive chambers, each containing the potential for life and the machinery of its systematic destruction. Dr. Aria Montoya moved like a shadow through these corridors, her adaptive camouflage suit rendering her nearly invisible against the sterile white backgrounds. Behind her, a specialized rescue team of 6 operatives moved with synchronized precision. They weren't just an extraction team. They were humanity's most advanced xenorescue unit. Genetic marker analysis complete, her neural interface whispered directly into her consciousness, identifying viable rescue targets. The facility's security systems were a marvel of technological complexity. Quantum encryption protocols, adaptive detection grids, genetic verification checkpoints that could identify an intruder at the molecular level. To any other species, this would be an impenetrable fortress. To humanity, it was an intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. Miguel Rodriguez, no relation to Elena, but sharing her same fierce determination, led the infiltration team. His cybernetic augmentations interfaced directly with the facility's communication networks, transforming each security protocol into a pathway of potential escape. "Targeting primary cultivation chambers," Miguel reported. "Identifying children marked for genetic elimination." The rescue wasn't just about saving individual lives. It was a strategic intervention designed to expose the entire Vornak genetic selection system. Each rescued child carried with them a communication device, not just a tracking system, but a sophisticated broadcasting platform. Their stories would be transmitted directly to the Vornak population, personal testimonies that would shatter institutional narratives. Dr. Montoya's hand touched the first genetic cultivation chamber. Advanced sensing technologies allowed her to read the intricate genetic markers of the child inside. A female infant, approximately 3 standard months old. Genetic markers suggested heightened cognitive potential, exactly the type of deviation the Vornak would eliminate. "Extraction protocol initiated," she murmured. The chamber's complex locking mechanisms began to interface with their adaptive technologies. Where traditional infiltration would require explosive breaching or complex hacking, human technology simply understood. The locks weren't defeated. They were comprehended. Alarms began to sound, but not the traditional klaxons of other species. These were quantum-linked communication networks that could predict and analyze intrusion patterns. Each alarm was both a warning and a data collection point. Miguel's augmentations were already 5 steps ahead. "Redirecting communication matrices," he announced. "They'll see what we want them to see." The first child emerged, then another, and another. Children with genetic markers that would have condemned them to elimination. children who represented potential the Vornak had deemed unworthy. Each rescue was a living indictment of an entire societal system. Broadcast protocols active, Dr. Montoya confirmed. The children's stories began to transmit, not just audio or visual records, but complex neural-linked narratives that could bypass traditional communication barriers. Personal experiences that would transform from individual stories to a collective trauma. A young Vornak technician monitoring a secondary system suddenly froze. The data streams weren't just information. They were something more profound. Personal experiences that challenged everything he understood about his species' genetic selection process. By the time the Vornak military response teams arrived, the facility had been transformed. Not destroyed. Not violated. Simply emptied. With evidence that would shake their society to its fundamental core. Mission complete, Miguel reported. But it was more than a mission. It was the first strike in a revolution that would redefine an entire species' understanding of potential. Dr. Montoya looked at the rescued children, each a living testament to the possibility that had been nearly erased. "Welcome home," she whispered. And in that moment, home meant something far more than a physical location. It meant potential. It meant hope. The revolution began not with weapons, but with a whisper. On Vorkar, in the vast underground networks that had always existed beneath the regime's rigid surface, Vortok assembled his resistance. He was not a traditional revolutionary, not a military leader or a political dissident. He was a geneticist who had spent decades documenting the silent genocide happening within his own species. Vortok's laboratory was a museum of suppressed potential, genetic records, personal histories, detailed documentation of every child eliminated, every potential life erased. Each file was a silent accusation, waiting for the moment to be unleashed. The broadcast from the rescued children arrived like a quantum pulse, information that didn't just communicate, but fundamentally rewrote neural pathways. In military academies across Vornak territories, young cadets began to question. Their neural-linked training systems, designed to reinforce genetic superiority narratives, suddenly encountered data that challenged everything they understood. A junior military analyst named Zurek was the first to openly challenge the system. During a standard tactical briefing, she interrupted her superior with a question that would echo through Vornak society. If we are so genetically superior, why are we afraid of our own potential? The room fell silent. Neural communication matrices froze. This was not just a question. It was an existential challenge. Vortok's resistance had prepared for this moment. Information networks that had existed in shadows for generations now activated. Not violent networks. Not military resistance, but something far more dangerous. A network of knowledge, of understanding. Genetic researchers who had secretly preserved eliminated genetic profiles began to share their hidden archives. Medical professionals who had witnessed the brutal selection processes started documenting their experiences. Children who had survived past elimination began to tell their stories. The Vornak military started to fragment. Entire squadrons found themselves engaged in philosophical debates rather than tactical preparations. Their neural-linked communication systems, designed for absolute hierarchy, became platforms of questioning. A mid-level military commander, Krelnax, made a decision that would be remembered in Vornak history. During a standard planetary defense drill, he redirected an entire battle group's communication channels to broadcast the stories of eliminated children. "We are not protecting a society," he announced. "We are maintaining a machine of systematic destruction." The broadcast spread like a quantum virus, not through violence, not through traditional revolution, but through understanding. Vortok understood something profound about revolution. It wasn't about fighting the system. It was about helping the system see itself. In research facilities, genetic engineers began to re-examine their work. The mathematical models of genetic selection that had seemed so perfect now looked like instruments of profound limitation. They weren't improving their species. They were destroying its most radical potential. The human intervention had provided the spark. But the revolution was entirely Vornak. Young Vornak across multiple planetary systems began to wear the genetic markers of those who had been eliminated as a form of protest. Neural communication networks became platforms of collective remembrance and questioning. Vortak's resistance had prepared data packages, not just information, but comprehensive psychological intervention strategies. Each package was designed to help Vornak individuals understand the true cost of their genetic selection processes. The revolution moved with a speed that defied traditional understanding of social change. It wasn't a violent overthrow. It was a collective awakening. Military units began to stand down. Research facilities opened their archives. The very institutions designed to enforce genetic purity now became platforms of collective healing. "We are not eliminating potential," Vortak announced in a broadcast that would be remembered as the turning point. "We are expanding our understanding of what it means to be Vornak." The human intervention had provided the initial disruption, but the transformation was entirely internal. A species was learning to see itself, not as a machine of genetic optimization, but as a complex, beautiful system of potential. And Vortak knew this was just the beginning. The tribunal chamber defied traditional architectural understanding. Suspended in quantum-stabilized space, its walls were living membranes that could shift between transparency and solid matter. Representatives from 200 different galactic species sat in a circular arrangement that suggested neither hierarchy nor submission. Krillak stood at the center, no longer just a witness, but the primary prosecutor of the most comprehensive investigation in galactic history. "This is not about the Vornak," he began, his voice amplified by neural link translation matrices. "This is about every species that has ever looked away." The holographic displays behind him were a nightmare of interconnected data, economic agreements, diplomatic communications, subtle endorsements of genetic selection processes that spanned centuries. No species was entirely innocent. Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat in the human delegation, her presence a calm focal point amidst the growing tension. She understood something profound. This tribunal was about more than punishment. It was about systemic transformation. The first witness was unexpected. Dr. Zirek, the Vornak military analyst who had first challenged her own society's systems, presented a comprehensive analysis of the genetic selection processes. Her testimony was not an accusation, but a clinical deconstruction of a systemic failure. "We did not just eliminate individuals," she explained, her neural displays showing complex genetic models. "We eliminated potential. We transformed evolutionary potential into a mathematical optimization problem." Holographic representations showed genetic markers dissolving and reforming. Each eliminated sequence represented thousands of potential lives, children deemed insufficient, erased before they could draw their first breath. The Crystalline Concordance delegation, known for their absolute commitment to non-intervention, found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Their transparent forms began to show microscopic fractures, a physical manifestation of their growing internal conflict. Kazarvox, the senior Dretel representative, attempted to deflect. "These are complex societal." "Genocide is not complex," Krelax interrupted. "It is a choice." Humanity's role was strategic and nuanced. They were not judges. They were facilitators of a broader understanding. Each piece of evidence had been meticulously gathered, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Commander Jack Harrison presented a comprehensive analysis of how multiple species had benefited from or ignored the Vornak's practices. Economic trade routes, diplomatic agreements, subtle endorsements that allowed the genetic selection to continue. The tribunal was transforming before everyone's eyes. It was no longer just an investigation. It was a collective reckoning. Vortak, the geneticist who had led the internal Vornak resistance, presented the most devastating evidence. Personal histories of eliminated children, genetic potential that had been erased, not as an emotional appeal, but as a precise scientific indictment. "We are not just discussing elimination," Vortak explained. "We are discussing the fundamental theft of evolutionary potential." The quantum adaptive tribunal systems began to process the information. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was a systemic analysis of institutional failure. Dr. Aria Montoya presented the rescued children, not as victims, but as living testimonies of potential. Each child represented a genetic marker that would have been eliminated. Now they were researchers, artists, potential leaders. Potential is not a mathematical equation, she declared. It is a living, breathing possibility. The tribunal's walls began to shift, not just visually, but in their fundamental quantum structure. The very space of investigation was transforming, becoming something more than a traditional judicial proceeding. Krillax's final statement was not a demand for punishment, but a call for understanding. "We are not here to destroy," he said. "We are here to reimagine what it means to be a civilization that values potential." As the tribunal continued, it became clear that this was more than an investigation. This was the beginning of a fundamental reimagining of galactic society. The human delegation sat quietly. They had not conquered. They had facilitated a profound moment of collective awakening.